So, obviously, super excited to have this discussion topic personally. But as we dive, deeper in, I think, to me, pushing the bounds and innovating is something that we constantly need to do. And if you think about, at one point, humans believed that the Earth was flat. Now, for the most part, with the exception of very, very, very minor few, we all recognize that the world is no longer flat and that we are not the center of the universe. But that was a standard, that was a default way of thinking. And I think for me today on this topic on cracking the code of activity-based incentives, I think the standard philosophy has been that it's extremely dangerous to pay on activity and it can lead to some disastrous outcomes, which I think, by the way, is true. But we have to ask ourselves, what makes that true? And what does the future look like where we actually solve the underlying problems for addressing those things? And so today, from a topic and dive in, I think we're going to walk you through, we've obviously made some investments and a big investment recently on ABI. But we really want to talk about, what makes activity-based incentives and how do you actually crack the code on addressing some of the challenges and thinking about the future state with that. And so two things before we start. I think first and foremost, I already see a ton of amazing people that have joined this call and in the audience, individuals that have years of experience from a sales comp perspective. And I think I just can't echo enough how much, if you have ideas, if you have questions, commentary, please do share in chat. There's a lot of other experts on the call today that can chime in and share their perspectives. And I think the more of a dialogue that we have, the more productive it will be for everyone. And then secondly, as we're going through, if you have questions that are more detailed, I may stop and kind of direct the conversation a certain way. But we certainly have enough to get through the whole hour today, even without. But that being said, I'm going to share my screen and I will kick us off here. Okay. Perfect. So I think I'm going to pull up a stat here to hear us off. I usually take these stats with a grain of salt. I think the actual stat itself and the absolute figure here is maybe less relevant than I think the recognizing that, yes, 2022 and 2023 have been difficult years. And I think specifically over the last 5 to 10 years, I think one of the observations that I've seen from the world of sales incentives and go-to-market teams is that marketing has become more data-driven and more agile and has actually supported sales organizations far better. And so, we are seeing things like, in 2023, only 33% of reps reported, attaining quotas. I mean, whether it's 33% or a slightly different number, we have seen this decline and we are, seeing an impact, especially given the last 2 years. Now, the number that actually is more meaningful is that reps typically spend a very small portion of their overall time on active selling activities. So we think about what the reps are doing day to day, and the majority of it is actually not driving revenue or driving outcomes. And so we think about how we optimize a significant portion of the spend that we put out into the go-to-market organization. And if you think about how sales compensation and how we approach motivating and incentivizing and one of the largest cost centers in the business, incentives are typically designed on driving an outcome. So we incentivize towards an outcome and we pay for the outcomes that align with a good customer experience and a good outcome for the enterprise and the business. And that's how we typically think about incentives, how we tie these two things together. But in reality, there's a missing piece here. And the missing piece is that our incentives are actually driving a behavior, and that behavior then drives the outcome. The problem is we create these incentives and we set these out. And so let's pick an example. I want to add a kicker for a multi-year term. So I'm going to incentivize a higher payout for multi-year terms than single-year terms. So we wait till the outcome to see how it's producing from a plan perspective and a plan effectiveness perspective. When in reality, the behavior that we're actually driving by creating that incentive is sales reps talking about multi-year term earlier in the sales process. Sales reps bringing up and building value cases and quotes that factor in multi-year terms and getting alignment from the prospects and the customers they're talking to. And I think these are the things where we're missing this data and this part of the puzzle earlier as a part of our incentive comp management. And so, if we think about most organizations, it's very clear that running a standardized sales process is much better for any business, and especially for scaling and growing organizations. And so, this is a stat from Harvard Business Review around the fact that businesses with a standardized sales process enjoy 30% more revenue compared to those that do not. This is not new. This is not anything mind-blowing. And even if you think about this next stat, where 50% of high-performing sales organizations admit to having closely monitored, strictly enforced, or automated sales processes, this is kind of like table stakes. If you want to scale an organization, building a machine that operates in a consistent way is going to lead to better customer outcomes and better revenue outcomes. So knowing all of this, right, we recognize that incentives are actually driving a behavior that drives an outcome. We recognize that consistent and structured sales process is going to drive a better outcome. And the final piece I'll leave you with is that we know that incentives being closer to the behavior drive a better adherence or better motivating or drive more motivation than incentives that are further away from the actual outcome. So we want to tie reward and the behavior as closely together as possible. We want to drive consistency in process, and we ultimately want to make sure that we're driving the right behaviors. And so when we think about activity-based incentives, we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, why haven't we used these more? And I think some of the answers and objections that we'll talk about in a little bit make a lot of sense. But before we do that, I want to talk about the status quo of what activity-based incentives today looks like. So if you think about ABI, there's a lot of risks with it. And there's a lot of risks for a good reason. But where it is used today is really primarily three key areas, from least risky to most risky, as I've outlined here. So we use ABIs, think about MBOs, where we just don't have data on outcomes. Maybe we're rolling out a new product in 2 years' time, and capital-intensive product, very large sales, and we want to start talking with the prospects way ahead of the launch to build up the pipeline. And so the only way we can actually measure on, and drive upside here is by creating incentives that pay on activities that hopefully will drive enough pipeline for the product launch, as an example. Or other types of MBOs where we just don't have the data to track on an individual level, and we want to create and still incentivize specific behavior. Least risky because there's no other option, and if we structure them well, we're constraining cost, we're constraining the investment that we're going to make, and hoping that we drive an outcome. The second type of ABI that we typically see would be where the outcomes are beyond the individual's control that we're trying to incentivize. So think about this as your typical SDR, sales development representative, or your BDR, business development representative, where we are basically paying these reps to schedule meetings, to get prospects into a buying cycle. And here, a buying cycle may be 6 to 12 months out. And so we want to motivate these reps to drive incremental behavior, incremental meetings, incremental opportunities. And we want to do so in a way where that reward is very closely tied to the behavior that they're driving. And so in this specific case, there are things that we can do to minimize some of the risk, right? We need to qualify some of these deals. We can audit some of the meetings that are getting booked and make sure that the process, but it's still not without risk. And in fact, we've seen organizations where the AEs and the BDRs have corroborated to, and again, very unethically, but corroborated to accept leads that should not have been accepted just so that the BDR could get paid. And I think there's always a risk when you do something like this. But again, this is one where it is, if you build the right process around it, it is worthwhile because of the upside. And then finally, there's a third point, and this is very rarely used and comes with the highest amount of risk. But this is one where the outcome is still within the control of the individual, but we're just so confident that a specific activity can drive an outcome that we're willing to pay money for that specific activity. And frankly, I don't actually have a good enough example, today to share without the kind of the future state that we're going to talk about. Because I think most organizations doing this without the right data, it comes at way too much of a risk to be able to execute on this. But typically these are the kind of the three paths that we see within ABI. So we step back and we take a look at who does this best. And to me, B2C businesses leverage incentives and specifically activity-based incentives the best. Without a doubt, they have leveraged all the data to tailor incentives and drive we tailor incentives that drive specific outcomes at specific points in time for the right customer based on their segment. So, whether it's Uber incentivizing referrals, and which again, tailored referral rates to specific individuals where they'll pay you $20 and pay the person that you sign up $20. I mean, they're just spending $40 up front with the hopes that there's an ROI for that behavior. Or, any of the food delivery services, there's a cost of customer acquisition through these incentives, but the payout is significant and it's worth an investment. Now, to do this, you think about the things that have to be addressed before you can actually execute the way that, B2Cs and these organizations typically incentivize their consumers. You have to have two things right, which has been historically very difficult for sales. You need to have one, robust, structured, trusted data for sales process. And so you need to have sales activity along the way that captures every part of the process and can be validated without human intervention and human compiling of the data. Because the moment you do that, now it becomes such a big burden that doesn't get done, and now we lose the robustness and the trustworthiness of the data, and in effect makes ABI very difficult. The second is that you need to have tooling that can scale not only the financial modeling, but have the agility to be able to react fast enough, because the further upstream of outcome that we go, the increase in the possible permutations that could happen in a process that do not lead to a good outcome. And so when we measure on outcome in the final stage, the possibilities of what we're paying on being a bad outcome get constrained naturally by what we define as an outcome. Whereas if we're paying upstream on activity, that activity has a lot of different pathways that could lead to poor. You think about it's kind of like further up the decision tree, and different paths and nodes along the decision tree will lead to different possible outcomes. And so if we can't react fast enough, we can't pivot and realign the activity-based incentives in a way to ensure that we're constantly falling towards that outcome that we desire. So historically, these have been the two biggest gaps to getting to this position. And if I just put this up here. So if we think about how we need to solve these, there's a common set of reservations that will come up from sales comp professionals. And I think, again, I want to dive into these because they're very, there's a lot of validity to these concerns. So the most common objections that we typically see on ABI in general is, first, that people will gamify behaviors, right? We put out incentives on specific activity, people are going to game it. Second, you're not paying for performance, you're paying for activity. And so what ends up happening is you're basically taking a pot of the money that is for variable comp to pay for top, the best players, the best performers. And we're basically just divvying them up amongst everyone that does an activity. And the third objection is that, we're paying on activity, but is that the highest ROI for the spend versus just paying on outcomes in a different way and actually being more motivating to the sales force? So I'm going to dive into each one of these three. And so when you think about the first one, and the common, one of the common objections is that not paying on performance. So if you think about what this means, we're basically saying and assuming two things for this to be true. We're assuming that behaviors can be exploited without a net revenue benefit, and that revenue, or ultimately reps optimize for their personal outcome, not necessarily for revenue of the organization. Okay. The thing is both of these are true, right? The surface area, as I mentioned, for gaming on activity increases significantly because we're further upstream of the outcome. And secondly, there's just so many possible permutations of things that can go wrong. And both of these assumptions are true, but I want to caveat one thing. The assumption that behaviors can be exploited, the gaming is going to happen regardless. It's just the fact that the permutations increase. And so when we think about the future where people gamify behaviors, that's always going to happen. The saving grace is if you have the right data where you can see in real time what is actually happening. And if reps are starting to do certain behaviors which are leading to bad outcomes, then it's just about, do we have the data to see that fast enough? And two, do we have the ability to react? And so if we have enough granular data and we have the confidence to understand, both statistically and methodically, that adjusting this ABI to X ABI is going to drive a better outcome, then we're just basically constantly pivoting and updating. And again, this is what happens in the world of consumer-facing incentives. Those referral programs are being changed all the time based off of the data that's happening and how individuals are using them. And we're only investing in areas that are going to lead to better outcomes. So that's the first. Not taking away that gamification is not a higher risk. It's certainly a higher risk with ABI. It's just that if you assume that we don't have the ability to counteract and react to those gaming behaviors, then you shouldn't invest in ABI. But if we can solve those two things, I think it addresses the risk there. The second is this concept of not paying for performance. And so I think the biggest assumption here with this objection is it assumes that we are paying on activity regardless of outcome. ABI is not just about paying for activity. It's about paying for activity that we believe is going to drive a better outcome. And so to me, again, it's about driving the agility in a way where we can counteract and constantly switch where we're allocating incentive dollars on activity based off of what is leading to a better outcome. And so it's absolutely not about just paying across the board and taking 10% of our total sales comp dollars and allocating them evenly to everyone that does a specific activity. It should only be an activity that leads to better outcomes. So when we think about that, you're actually effectively saying that, yes, we're paying on ABIs, but we're only paying those activity dollars to reps that adhere to process that's guaranteed to drive a better outcome for us. And how fast we can pivot means ultimately how fast we can produce a better outcome for ourselves as a business. Now, again, this takes into account the first point of you need to have the data, you need to be able to react fast enough with the system. But I think this, again, is another one of a very common objection that can be addressed and counteracted. The final piece here is the fact is this the best area for us to spend and the highest ROI area for us to spend? And yes, allocating dollars to outcomes in theory could be just as motivating as allocating dollars to activities that drive outcomes with less risk. But the point, again, this is when you think about like the assumption that we're making here, it's that reps are just, they're coin operated, and that just paying them for specific activities is actually going to detract from what they're going to do versus be more motivating. When in reality, we should be allocating more money to areas that are going to drive a better outcome for both the seller and the business. Because at the end of the day, every sales process, every sale is not made equal. And $100,000 sale is not necessarily the same as every other $100,000 sale that we make as an organization. In fact, we know that, and we try to address our comp plans that pay on outcomes to cover that, but this balance of trying to keep a plan simple and have the rep understand it makes that more difficult versus thinking about leveraging APIs to actually drive behavior in real time. So, we talk about this example where you have $100,000 sale that gets made by rep A versus rep B. And in both these cases, if you think about it, in one, the sales process was followed. It was a consistent and aligned with what we set out as best practice in an organization. It resulted in a much smoother process that required significantly less resources from our internal team, but also significantly less resources and wasted time from the customer. It led to a better value prop build, lower discount rates, and ultimately a much faster sales cycle. And so that $100,000 that was produced for the business in reality should get paid more than the $100,000 on the right by rep B, where we didn't engage the customer the right way. We didn't understand the key stakeholders involved and had to repeat meetings. And as a result, had to spend significant internal resources, significant resources on the customer side, longer sales process, longer sales cycle, and as a result, higher discount rates because the value case wasn't built up the right way. And now we're paying $100,000, for $100,000 of ARR in both cases. We're likely paying the same for most organizations. And so, to me, the goal here is to think about a future where every part of the sales process is captured. And so, I know I've covered at a high level the common objections, and I'm happy to come to it as there are more questions and points to cover. But I think, in talking about the vision, and I'm going to talk about the very far future vision before we come back to kind of like the roadmap and how to get there. But if you think about the world that we're living in sales, I think if you go back 30 years ago, the average CMO of a retail organization, that person, that human being, is not the same human being as the average CMO of an e-commerce retail brand today. You had a very creative, brand-oriented marketer. You have today a very performance marketing, data-driven, analytical marketer. And their roles are not similar. The things they do on a day-to-day basis are not similar. How they make investments is not similar. And the reason for that were basically threefold. We had a massive investment in data collection. And so access to data for marketing became available in ways that you could actually attribute specific investments in marketing down to the individual customer as they go through your process, right? Whether they interact with parts of your store online, whether they add something to the shopping cart, they leave, they come back. Now we can, we have that data. We understand which incentives, which promote marketing campaigns are touching that specific customer. Second is the ability to have interconnected technology to be able to tie all of these data sources with all the tooling that we use to build campaigns, et cetera, and roll out to the end user. And then the third piece is the scaling of decision making. And so you don't have someone sitting at a retail brand that you buy from today recognizing manually that you left a shopping cart unused or filled and unpurchased, and follow up with you manually a day later to say, here's a 10% discount code. That decision-making process is built in within a workflow that kicks off the moment that these things and parameters are met for a specific stakeholder and a specific segment of the customer base. And to me, sales is going through this renaissance moment as we speak. So marketing went through this over the last 20 years, 30 years, and we're seeing sales go through this in the last 5-10 years. And over the next coming 10 years, this is fundamentally going to be the world that we live in, because we have more calls. We have more calls and interactions with our customers that are captured today as a part of the sales process than we've ever had before. And so if you think about a future that's not too distant, a rep is on a Zoom call with a prospect. There's a very key inflection point. The prospect, whether it says something or we're at a key decision period in the sales motion, this is exactly the time for that rep to ask the hard question, to do the hard thing. And why wouldn't we think about this as the perfect time to highlight and nudge that behavior and give them the next best action and make it very clear the consequences or the upside of doing this? And so you think about being on a Zoom call and actually prompting the rep with a real-time implication of them asking a question or not asking a question. This is not that far off, right? And because the benefit of doing so is just so much is so great, and the data is there, and we can bring it all together through interconnected tech, the availability of all the data that we have, and ultimately the scaling of decision making. So to me, this is the future that we're working towards. I want to walk through the roadmap to activity-based incentives as how we see it in the near term and how we get there. So first and foremost, as sales comp professionals, it's leveraging all the data on sales process today to better design incentives on outcomes. So even if we don't use ABI, right? You don't use activity-based incentives within your organization, we should be aiming to get as much of the sales process and the sales activity data as a part of our sales performance management platforms and as a part of the planning process to design better incentives first, and second, to be able to see how our incentives are actually performing far ahead of the outcomes. Because if you have a 6-month sales cycle and we roll out an incentive on day one, it's going to take us 6 months before we start to see the real outcomes for that incentive, versus rolling out an incentive plan, seeing the activity shifts, and are they coming in as forecasted or behind, and then pivoting in real time so that we don't have a 6-month lag. The second thing is now, and so again, it's getting that access to data, revamping in step 2, the way that we use that data to design incentives and adjust. And then step 3 is, okay, now as we've done this, it's to start leveraging this data to create incentives that align outcomes with activities. And so if you think about a world where we can now start to say, that 100K deal where you didn't follow the sales process, I'm not going to pay you as much as the 100K deal where you did. And it's these 5 critical processes that we've demonstrated over years of tracking this data that prove to be a much better outcome and a much better alignment of customer experience with what the business desires for longer term outcome. And so we start to kind of weave this in, and then over time, by step 4, we can get towards that, the real-time insights and the capabilities for deploying incentives on activities that drive the right behavior and drives a much better upside. So I'm going to dive into each of these right now. So if you think about step 1, I think, as I mentioned today, we hypothesize on what the plan outcomes are going to be, and then we wait for the result to come in. A perfect example is back to that multi-year kicker. Instead of just rolling out a multi-year kicker, we should roll out a multi-year kicker and then determine where in the sales process have we seen reps that have a higher percentage of multi-year deals do well in conveying to the customer, highlight those as key specific areas, and then collect the data on the sales process for those specific key steps and understand, are we seeing an uptick in sales activity at these key steps from reps post launching the incentive versus not. And yeah, I agree, Meredith, 100%. It's collecting the data to actually report on where we have an attainment distribution curve. What are the activities and the sales process steps that are being done by the best of the best versus the worst reps? And how do we, bring the bell curve up, and how do we bring the reps that are the B players up to A players? And then how do we elevate and pay on activities that the A players are doing to drive better outcomes? And so bringing that data within a single, within our sales performance management tools into a dashboard to be able to help us better track and design is certainly going to be extremely helpful. The second thing is, as I mentioned, it's incentivizing different parts of the deal process. So, can we create incentives as we become more and more confident that these key steps are actually driving a better outcome? Then instead of taking the risk and saying, I'm going to pay you $100 for every demo call that you do, where yes, that's a much higher likelihood for it to be gamed, and how, we need to react very quickly if it's not actually producing the right outcomes. It might be that we recognize that, engaging the right economic buyers, having IT alignment call completed, building a very detailed and ROI case that's delivered to the right stakeholders, and making sure there's an executive alignment call, having these things scheduled and done and executed at the right stage of the sales process will result in a plus 3% payout when the deal closes. And the only way to do this is to make sure that you are actively capturing that sales activity data, mapping it automatically in a compliant way, and visualizing this to the rep in real time, so that as they're going through the sales motion, they recognize, I've completed the key steps that are required of me, and that is going to impact my payouts. Otherwise, I'm actually going to leave money on the table for bringing a deal across the line that is not aligned with how this business runs their sales motions. And if you think about the final piece, as you think about the path to building this out, you need to think about how we de-risk this future state. And it's only possible when you capture the data, are tracking it as a part of your process in real time for the years to come, so that as we get to that future state and you're deploying incentives that are based off of activity, you're doing so with the confidence in the data that you have. And as I shared, we've at Forma, we've made we recently announced that we made the acquisition of SeaMonster, and SeaMonster is a SaaS platform that is about building and measuring a consistent sales motion, a consistent sales process, where we integrate all the sales data that comes upstream, both from CRM all the way through to call transcripts from things like Gong, SalesLoft, Zoom, Teams, all into a platform where then you can kind of capture and track different parts of the sales process and feed it into your tracking and visibility. Now, we've obviously made this investment because we believe that the longer term future is an alignment of sales process and sales compensation management all in one. And we don't believe a world where not tracking both together is going to lead to a better outcome. And so, obviously this is something we're very passionate about as a company, but I hope that, everyone walked away today with at least, a push and a desire to capture more of this data within the process that you run through today from a design perspective. Because I think at the very least, it's only going to make for better designed incentives, better designed outcomes, or better designed incentives, better designed, comp planning, and ultimately better outcomes for the business. And with that, I will open it up to Q&A to the rest of the org. I don't know if I missed any questions. Okay. So I know I blitzed through that because I have a tendency to get excited about this specific topic. But I'm curious if anyone, one of the common I see people have raised their hand. I'm not sure. Let me actually see how I can. Okay, sorry. Yeah, let me answer some of these questions. So, Karen, I think in this case, isn't this model really more for an inside sales team? So, I think that maybe historically, where you had more of like a call center approach where every activity is tracked. I mean, this is kind of very common to have these types of incentives and activity-based tracking in call centers, and we've definitely certainly seen that in the past. I think what we're seeing is that every part of the sales motion today is evolving to be much more data rich. And so, we're seeing things like, calls be, any account executive doing, calls with the prospects are being captured or being tracked. In fact, even platforms like Gong are shifting to kind of having an optionality to be able to record in-person meetings to capture that activity and the behavior. And so the more and more data that we have from every interaction, it's starting to balance the playing field between inside sales versus what historically has been kind of field sales. And so that's why we think about this as impacting far more than just inside sellers. Kenny, I see you put up your hand here. I'm not sure how I can let you in, but in the meantime, I'll answer Ryan's question. So I'll just share this here. Do you worry about having multiple touch points being evaluated for comp as a part of the process? That can be distracting. Is there a worry about not getting bogged down in the process versus scoring points? So I 100%, yeah, I think there's definitely a risk in if you jump too fast into this, there's a risk. Obviously, there's an element of we want to keep comp plans simple so they're understood. And if you incentivize the wrong behaviors, it could lead to, of course, very, very bad outcomes. If you're going to invest here, it has to be in an area where we are extremely confident that the upside of that outcome is extremely high. And let me give you an example of when you go through a design process today for sales comp. What is the definition of an outcome? Because rarely is the definition of an outcome just the ARR that we're measuring at the end of at the bottom of the quote, right? Or the sales. As sales comp professionals, we are going through it and looking at the longer term impact of these deals. Okay, deals that that look like X have a higher retention rate, have a lower probability to attrition. We recognize the deals that look like this from businesses in this segment have a higher compliance with payments, and so we're not going to have any kind of bad accounts receivable. And we, as a result, create incentives that align with those types of outcomes. So we're kind of already doing this. We're just doing this at the very tail end. And all we're saying here is, okay, for the specific sales processes that come earlier, there are likely process steps where if they are done, they tend to produce an outsized return compared to parts of the process that are not doing this. And I think Robert's message is spot on. It is a delicate balance of doing their job versus driving the right behavior. It's we're expecting you to drive a sales motion and be a sales professional. You're getting paid a base portion of your salary on driving that outcome. The key is where do we need to incentivize an activity or part of that process because it's so critical. And I think the step one here is not to actually pay on that activity. It's to pay more or less on the outcomes if that activity was done or not done. I don't know if that helped answer the question, Ryan. It's a great question, Karen. In terms of driving a micromanagement feeling to reps, to reps behavior. I think there's an element here of maybe at first it might feel like we're ripping the Band-Aid. I mean, if you go back 10 years ago even, or 15 years ago, and you ask the average sales organization, are you okay with having every single sales call that you do recorded? I imagine the pushback would be pretty significant. And if you think about the world today, the average seller sees that as a benefit. I can run this call. I can make sure that I capture all the notes and all the things that are required for me to execute on this customer very well. I can get coaching on it afterwards from my manager and not have to have them sit beside me in every single meeting. And I think the same thing here. By paying for specific activities that are executed well, and again, step one is capturing that data so that we understand what a good sales motion looks like. We're actually going to be incentivizing a sales motion that enables the average performer to perform more like the A player. And so I think this, it might initially feel like it's micromanaging or kind of guiding in steps, but ideally we're only doing so where we're 100% sure we're driving a much better outcome. Cade, I think, so just to kind of summarize the question, I think, this is about driving, is this about replacing MBOs? I think to some extent, yes. I mean, a lot of the MBOs today are typically based on, certain types of activity data that we're not capturing. And in my mind, there's a very compelling reason to make sure that as much as possible, MBOs are calculated in a very structured way. Otherwise, they end up just being paid out at 100%, and we might as well just take the dollars out and put them into base. And so to your point on kind of the administration of that, part of the reason why we made the investment in SeaMonster is the fact that by automating the capture and allocation of activities, and this is the critical step, is you need to ingest all that data and then be able to automatically bucket it into specific behaviors. because the admin work of tracking all these different steps and all these different activities and putting them into buckets that we then use to pay is extremely onerous for most organizations. And so the way that you have to do it is you have to build an automation to capture and do so. Yeah. Awesome. If there's anything else, I don't know if there are any other questions, but otherwise, just to wrap up today and give everyone back a little bit more time, I just want to say thank you for joining, and please do not hesitate to reach out with any other questions. And then one final reminder, we do have Nudge 2024 conference coming up midsummer, and the goal of this conference is ultimately we want to bring in a variety of different speakers and guests that bring a different perspective and lens on incentives and think about how we can help the broader community with plan design as they go into the cycle. And so hope to see you all there. And then following this event, we will be sending out the link, which will include the recording and I believe the deck. So thank you again, and hope you have a great rest of your week.